just this afternoon, I was talking to a friend saying that I was going to be doing this podcast, and he was just like, you picked Bridget Jones's Diary? Why? I'm like, because it's great. That's why.
Welcome to the Crooked Table Podcast, where we discuss the world of film from a fresh angle. And now your host, Robert Yanis Jr.
Welcome to the Crooked Table Podcast. This is Rob. On this show, we like to democratize the film criticism conversation by bringing on fans and critics alike to talk about a movie that really resonated with them, either something they grew up with or something that, for whatever reason, they have a personal connection to. So this episode, I am joined by Karen Peterson. Welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much. Hello.
So, of course, I know you best as one quarter of the Citizen Dame podcast, but could you tell people a little bit about who you are and what you have going on?
Oh, wow. A little bit about who I am. So I got started in the film criticism world with Award Circuit, where we cover all kinds of entertainment stuff, but our primary focus is on awards for television and film. And that's actually how I met Kristen Lopez, who's one of my colleagues, one of my co-hosts on the Citizen Dame podcast, because we, there's all these great film podcasts out there, but so many of them are either all men or there's like a token woman, and we were like, screw that, we want one that's all girls. So we got a couple of other wonderful ladies to join us. So I still do Award Circuit, but I also do Citizen Dame too. So it's a lot of fun, it's a lot of work, but it's totally worth it.
And you're also on another podcast too, am I correct?
I am. I also have another podcast, The Watch and Talk, where it's just a movie review, and we do that every week.
And I think you and I just started corresponding just kind of casually on Twitter. I believe I reached out to you for some quotes for a couple articles that I'd written in the past, that kind of thing. But this is the first time that we've actually spoken over in any other capacity other than online. It's great to talk to you, alas.
Yeah, you too. This is really fun. I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Cool. Same here. And so this movie, when I mentioned to you that I wanted you to be on the podcast, you wanted a little time to think it over, and then you pretty much landed on this. And I guess before we get into exactly why, let's just hear a little bit of the trailer for the movie we're going to discuss in this episode, Bridget Jones's Diary.
In every life, there comes a time to turn the page.
I decided to get a grip on my life and start a diary.
Resolution number 1.
Will not be paranoid about weight.
Will not form romantic attachments to any of the following: alcoholics, workaholics, sleeping toms, or perverts. And will not fantasize about a particular person who embodies all these things. My boss.
I was wondering if you might care for dinner Friday night.
That was a little bit of the trailer for Bridget Jones's Diary. So, Karen, tell me a little bit about what this movie is to you, what your history is with it, and why this is the one you ultimately ended up wanting to talk about.
So I don't remember actually the first time I watched Bridget Jones's Diary. I don't even think I saw it in the theater. In fact, I'm not sure if I saw it before Renee Zellweger got nominated for Best Actress for it. But the first time I watched it, I just fell in love with it. It's this very funny romantic comedy, but there's other things about it that really make it stand out. And so when you asked me what movie I wanted to talk about, I mean, there are thousands of movies I've seen and hundreds of movies that I really, really enjoy a lot. And so it was hard at first I thought, oh, this is going to be really hard to narrow down. What do I want to talk about? But somehow right around the time that we were talking about this, I found myself in multiple conversations with different people completely randomly, where I found myself defending Renee Zellweger's Oscar nomination and defending the movie from people who think it's just this trite, light-hearted, fluffy thing. And so I was just like, nope, you know what? I know what I want to do. I'm going to defend Bridget Jones's Diary. So that's how we ended up here today.
Yeah, I think I saw it not in theaters as well. I think I caught up with it probably on VHS or DVD, whichever one I was still on at that point. I guess I had moved on to DVD by 2001 or 2. So yeah, and I remembered it fondly. I didn't really rewatch it a lot, but I know that it was the kind of movie that was on cable constantly, I believe. So over the years, I think it really helped gain traction. And then, of course, the sequel came out in 2004 because this one was a huge box office hit. I mean, it had a $25 million budget. It made 71 in North America and 281 worldwide. So that's pretty good return on investment. And this is, early 2000s, late 90s, which was really prime territory for romantic comedies, which nowadays you hardly see any of them hit that kind of box office return. I mean, now it's all franchises. And so it's really, in a way, kind of a time capsule of a different era in cinema,
It is. Well, one of the other reasons I really wanted to talk about this, or one of the things I was looking at with movies I wanted to bring up, was the fact that it has a female director. And the fact that it was so successful and yielded an Oscar nomination and a couple Golden Globe and BAFTA nominations too at the time, and was directed by a woman, that also makes it pretty significant. Yeah,
I think so. I think in the fact that I think this was her first. She's kind of a Sharon Maguire. This is the filmmaker's name we should mention. She had done a lot of documentary work and things like that before this. And then after this film, she made a movie called Incendiary in 2008, and then nothing until the third Bridget Jones movie, Bridget Jones's Baby, which was in 2016. So I don't know what's going on, what happened there. If it's, what do you think happened? Why weren't we seeing more output from her in between those? Do you think it's just the industry and like the nature of it, I guess, that we're learning more and more about all the time now?
Yeah, I actually read an interview with her when Bridget Jones's Baby was coming out, or right after she had been announced as the director on it, something like that. And yeah, it wasn't that she decided to pull away. It was just that even though she had done this really successful movie, she wasn't getting opportunities to direct. Like, men with those kinds of numbers, they would have been having movies thrown at them left and right. Mm-hmm. But for her, it just wasn't that case. And in fact, the sequel, they had a different... They actually still stayed with a female director, which doesn't usually happen for Bridget Jones' The Edge of Reason. But it wasn't her. It was someone else. And so they actually, because it had been so long, and she had been out of the game for a long time and hadn't been really welcomed back, she actually took a little bit of convincing to agree to do Bridget Jones's Baby. But
the first movie and books obviously had a big cultural impact when it came out. It basically made Renee Zellweger kind of a marquee star. Like, this was all of a sudden she was leading movies. This was right before Chicago, and she'd been in things before, but never in the spotlight in this way. As you mentioned, it got her first Oscar nomination. And the screenplay is co-written by Helen Fielding, Richard Curtis, of course, who has done a lot of his own films, and Andrew Davies, who I discovered in my research actually wrote the 1995 Pride and Prejudice that this is heavily riffing on. And we'll get into that in a minute.
Yeah. And by the way, just as a fun little aside, on the DVD for Edge of Reason, there's a really funny, and you can probably find this on YouTube now too. There's a really funny video that they recorded. It's Renee Zellweger as Bridget Jones interviewing Colin Firth as Colin Firth, and she's talking to him, and the joke is that he's supposed to be there for an interview for some other movie, and she just keeps coming back to the 95 Pride and Prejudice, and that's all she can talk about, and it's hilarious.
That's awesome. I'll have to check that out. So I guess where should we start with this? To delve into the film itself. So when Renee Zellweger was cast, this is already kind of an iconic literary character, and I think there was at least a mild controversy as far as casting an American as this British character and whether or not she was going to pull off the accent and all of that. And were you aware of that whole situation when it was developing?
Not while it was developing, but I definitely knew about it after the fact. And yeah, it was a big deal. People were talking about, like, well, why are they getting an American to play this role? Which, it's funny because they never ask why British people are playing American roles, but right. But yeah, I remember that was a big deal, and people talking about whether she managed the accent or not. And I think the general conclusion was that she did a pretty dang good job with it.
Yeah, this is one of those examples of an American pulling off a British accent and getting a general approval. A lot of times I feel like this is really more of the exception than the rule when it comes to that, though. And the fact that she was able, I think I read that she gained 20 pounds for this role because
I think it was 40.
Was it even more? Okay, see. And then because obviously that's part of Bridget's journey. She starts off the whole film with this list of goals, and I guess we can kind of jump into it from here. We'll pick up Colin Firth and Hugh Grant as we go along. So she starts off, and she first of all, she has very kind of negative self-talk in the beginning. She's like, "Oh, it's my 32nd year of being single." Go into a little bit about like the opening of this movie. Like, did it capture you right off the bat? And what about the style that Sharon Maguire uses here really brings this character to life for you?
So it's funny because when I first saw this movie, I was in my early 20s, and I'm older than Bridget now. But it's funny because when I saw it originally, this introduction, I'm 32, I'm single, I'm not really going anywhere, I work this thankless job, all these things. It was like I was seeing what I worried about my life being in 10 years or so. And now I look back and I'm like, oh, it's so cute that she was worried about that, So it's kind of funny how that's changed. But I think I think the whole introduction is really it's really well done. The way that we meet Bridget, the way that we meet the people in her life, I think that it's really that. You have to remember that this is based on Helen Fielding's book, which is written like a diary. It's not written in, complete prose and things. It's a lot of bullet points and things like that. And so there were a lot of fans of the book that were going into this having, already loved the story, but how do you bridge that? And I think that what they accomplish with the screenplay and what Sharon Maguire accomplishes is a really good way to show this is really about a woman who's keeping a diary for very specific reasons. And so I love that intro.
Yeah, I think she's trying to hold herself accountable and actually, change her behavior when it comes to dating and the way she takes care of herself and all of that stuff. And just the beginning, we see Gemma Jones as her mom and Jim Broadbent as her dad. So right off the bat, you have these like ubiquitous British character actors showing up, and then we get the slow motion reveal of Colin Firth with the pan down to the reindeer jumper, which I thought that was great. Go ahead. You sound like you're going to say something.
Yeah. Oh, no, it's so great because she has this moment. Her mother has been trying to set her up because this is what mothers do with their adult daughters who are single, is like, oh, no, we have to get you someone. But of course, her mom doesn't get her, right? Because all she's worried about is her daughter finding someone that loves her. And there's very specific distinction there, but she's not really worried about who that is as long as her daughter has someone.
Right.
And so when she's talking about this and her mother has said like, oh yeah, go meet Mark Darcy, he's great. And so then she has that moment where she sees him and she's like, oh, he's actually really cute. Maybe mom actually did a good job this time. And then she sees that reindeer jumper and she's like, wait. There's always a catch. There's always something wrong. And this is it.
Well, at first, he looks like Colin Firth. So naturally, she's like,
Colin Firth is a handsome man.
Exactly. And the casting of him is very purposeful, of course, because he played Darcy in Pride and Prejudice in 1995. And it seems that he really wanted to, I guess, kind of poke fun at that performance a little bit and give it more of a comedic take on the story and kind of, I guess, play into the joke. And I think it actually makes this film that much stronger for it.
Yeah, I think this is a good enough story that it would have, but it really does add something to it that you've got Mr. Darcy, who, the 95 Pride and Prejudice is kind of a gold standard of telling that story. And at least for me, that's my personal favorite. I don't much care for the Keira Knightley version, but yeah, it's this really iconic role. It's one that Colin Firth, it took years for him to be able to get away from people just recognizing him for that. And so I think this was kind of his opportunity to have some fun with the thing that made him a star. And I think that he does such a good job of playing Mr. Darcy, but also giving him a little bit of a different edge.
Mm-hmm. And the difficulty, I think, in that character specifically is that you have to be charming while still socially awkward and mysterious, because obviously there's the big twist that they get to at the very end of the movie regarding him, and you never really know where he's coming from, which I think makes the love triangle, which it's not even really that for most of it. It's really just kind of her and her life. It makes it that much trickier to pull off on screen, if that makes sense.
It does, yeah. And that's the thing that I love about the character of Mark Darcy, even more than Mr. Darcy, is that he is socially awkward, but because of his fancy job and his, he's got this kind of prim and proper lifestyle, it comes across as if he's a snob and he's looking down his nose at everybody. But when you consider what his job is, he's a human rights lawyer. His whole job is all dedicated to helping immigrants and the disenfranchised and the underserved. That's not someone who's a snob, And so he's constantly just constantly misunderstood, I think. People think that he's one thing and they don't recognize who he really is because he's awkward and because he doesn't really know how to have a normal human conversation. Right.
They exactly. They assume that he is something, and then when they confront him, he doesn't do a whole lot to change their minds, unfortunately.
Right.
And it takes him almost the entire running time of the film to really figure out what he wants to say and get the opportunity to say it. But again, we'll get to that in a little bit. So they have their awkward meeting, and then we have her singing Celine Dion's All by Myself, and over the credits, and delving right into, okay, this is my resolution. This, it seems like it focuses pretty much on her weight and then her vices and her dating habits. Those are kind of the three main areas that she's really working on.
Honestly, that's pretty typical for people, like, what are the things I need to fix about myself? Obviously, it's my outward appearance. But one of the things that I really like in that, where she's making her resolutions, is, of course, she's doing these things because she wants to find love, but she's not researching, what do I need to do? What is it that men are looking for so I can become that? She's looking at, what do I want to change about myself so that then I will be more attractive to the opposite sex, which is a very different thing. And I think that that's easy to dismiss or overlook. But I that's one of the many things I love about Bridget, is that it's really, she wants to improve herself so that she can attract the right person. She's not trying to become what the right person wants.
Right. And I think that's probably a distinction that you only really get underlined, at least in the same way, with a female director at the helm. Had this been a male directing it, it probably would have been more like, it probably would have viewed closer to like something like Grease, where, at the end of the movie, Olivia Newton-John just decides to be exactly what Danny wants, and then he can just take off his leather jacket and go back to living his life, I guess. It probably would have ended up more in that direction. And I think you make a good point that she's really focusing on, I need to feel better about me. How do I feel more comfortable in my own skin? And then, of course, Hugh Grant is lingering around, making that a lot more complicated, as Hugh Grant tends to do. So, you get Renee Zellweger caught in kind of a charm off for 2 hours between Hugh Grant and Colin Firth. What did you think of Hugh Grant in this movie? And I think at this point, he hadn't really played played his sort of like foppishly charming role, but in this kind of sleazy way very much. I feel like that was a departure for him at the time. Am I correct with that?
Yeah, I would say it was, because before that, I mean, his big roles were like 4 Weddings and a Funeral or Notting Hill or 9 Months. These movies where he's kind of the awkward guy at the center of his story, and now he's the scoundrel on the side, like lurking on the edges, wanting to cause problems. And I think he does it so well that it's hard for me to believe that's not just really who he is.
No, it feels like this performance feels like the prototype of his role in Paddington 2 in kind of a weird way. Like that's who Daniel Cleaver ends up being. He just takes the theatricality to a new level.
It's the logical progression.
Yeah, there you go. Straight line from Bridget Jones' Diary to Paddington 2.
There you go. But yeah, what I think is interesting about Daniel, just looking at the film and looking at his entire arc in it, and of course there's more that happens with him in The Edge of Reason, but particularly in Diary, it's interesting because he starts off this relationship with Bridget based entirely on sex. He just is like intrigued by her because she's a little bit weird and totally different from what he normally goes for, but he's just in it for fun. He's not in it for an actual relationship. But when she starts to pull away, he feels something there. And it doesn't, like, his relationship with her doesn't change him as a person, but the part of the reason that she's constantly drawn to him and has these moments of weakness with him is because there is something there, even if he's not willing to be a grown up about it and change himself to be worthy of her. He's still drawn to her because of who she is. Mm-hmm. And that's not something I think he would ever understand, even though he says as much as at one point, but I don't think he really even understands what that means.
That's the other thing that really complicates, I think, this relationship is that it starts off, flirtatiously over, email, which, is weird enough as it is, but it's also in the workplace and everything. Like he's her boss, so that adds another level of complexity, and it makes me feel. It feels like that's a dynamic in this kind of movie that you wouldn't really see as much now because there would be all these questions of harassment and things like that, which some of his behavior in this movie gets pretty much crosses that line. I'd say a few times early on.
Oh, yeah, he's an HR nightmare. I mean, there's just no getting around that. But the thing is that if she had shut that down right away, then he probably would have stopped. But because she opened that door just even a little bit, that gives him permission to continue. But yeah, I mean, just his initial email to her is like, whoa, that's pretty bold, dude.
And then I think she says at one point, because I like the joke, I guess, in their initial emails is the formality of their language with like the bodiness of what they're talking about. So she's like, oh, seduced by the informality of this messaging medium and things like that. I'm like, oh man, if this was now, this would totally be, they'd just be sliding into each other's DMs on Twitter or something.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's that he's used to being the dumper. It seems like it's very obviously the case there. And so it's that kind of thing that he's the kind of guy that he's in it for fun, but then as soon as it turns real, he shuts down. And then I think watching the movie as objectively, not from Bridget's vantage point 100%, we can kind of see that that's what's going on, and maybe she does on some level too, but she's choosing to ignore it. So it creates an interesting, I think, dynamic with the viewer who has a pretty clear idea of what this guy's about. Whenever she brings up, oh, do you love me, and things like that, he just kind of brushes it off or makes it a joke or whatever. So we can kind of see through that a little bit more than she can, and I think there's a level of dramatic irony involved in there as well.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's the thing. And like the conversation she has with her dad when he finds out that she's got a boyfriend and it's Daniel and he's never met him, hasn't even heard about him. And he asks, is he good for you? Does he treat you well? And she says, yeah. She tells her father that Daniel is perfect. And the thing is that even in that moment, she knows perfectly well he's not. And this is something that we do a lot, way too much. Like we try to convince ourselves that the guy we're with that we know is all wrong for us is he's okay and he's good, and we want other people to believe that. And so I love that conversation that she has with her dad because of the fact that it's like we know he isn't, and we know that she knows really deep down that he isn't either.
Well, there's also There's also an optimism and a persistence in her that I think makes her really endearing as well. Like, she goes into it and, you know, part of her knows that this is probably kind of a doomed romance. Things don't go her way. We have a montage of her being sad, eating like ice cream or whatever she has, muesli, I think, at one point, because she doesn't have much in her fridge. And then, you know, she brushes right past that and shakes herself off and gets back to it. And I think that's really refreshing to see on screen. So she keeps getting into these, you know, making these bad decisions with men, and then, you know, but she never gets to the point where she, at least not in this movie, where she wants to settle. She'd rather, I think, at some point rather be, I think she even says it at one point, a tragic spinster than be with someone who's not really worthy of her. And I think that's a great thing to see in a movie like this.
Yeah, and that's one of the other things I love about Bridget is that she, even though she ends up with this guy that she knows is completely wrong, she still ultimately she's someone who knows her worth. She knows that she has value, and she's not really willing to settle. She's not going to stick with Daniel even after he mistreats her. She's not going to stick with him just to have someone around. She's willing to walk away from that relationship when it's bad. There's something else that I really love that I want to mention is it's at the Tarts and Vickers party. And I don't know who, I think it's her aunt, is asking her about this boyfriend that she's seeing, and Mark happens to be standing there, and she asks Mark, is this man good enough for our Bridget? And he says, absolutely not. And she gets so offended by that. She just bristles. But it's like, so because of her feelings toward Mark and because of this wrong information she's gotten about him, she's not willing to listen. But there's so much care in that moment. Yeah. Mark really, like, even if he doesn't even know what he's feeling for her right then, like, he actually sees her too as someone with value. And I love that moment. She completely brushes it aside, but it's really significant.
Well, it builds to his big speech later on, which is like the most swoon-worthy moment in the whole film, where she goes...
It's what every person ever wants to hear.
Yeah, exactly. Where she says, you know, is that the part where he's like, I like you very much. Yeah, I like you very much just as you are. And that's the key phrase that I think... you know, even Bridget doesn't like herself just as she is. Even she's like, man, I really got to work on myself. I got to lose weight. I got to stop smoking and drinking so much and like whatever, and work on my life choices. And he's like, no, I'll accept you exactly the way you are. And that's a beautiful sentiment right there. And
it really is. And it's one of those moments where the wall comes down a little bit for Mark, because he seems like someone who would see himself as too good for someone like Bridget. And the fact that he's sitting there saying, I like you like this mess of a person who has this crazy mother and has like these vulgar friends, and you smoke a lot and stuff. He doesn't care about that. He doesn't see any of that. He sees her. And it's another moment where, like, it, at first when he says it, because he, you know, she has overheard him say some not very nice things about her. But in that time, he says, I like you very much. And she interrupts him. Oh, apart from this and that and that. And he's like, no. And that's when he says the line, just as you are. And it really, hearing that from him, from someone who she just assumes wouldn't even give her a second thought, that right there changes something in her brain, because then it goes right into a conversation she's having with her friends, where she has related the story to them, and they're all just like speechless. They don't know what to say. And the one friend, Tom, he's like, but you hate this guy, right? And she's like, yeah, I totally do. I hate him. Like, she doesn't even know what to say to this, because it's just such a change from what she thought she knew about him, and also a little bit about how she sees herself.
It's a huge turning point in the film, because that's really when it does become a love triangle. Up to that point, it's just her and her doomed relationship with Daniel, which we should mention. I don't want to blow past the scene where she quits. Where not only does she, you know, stand up for herself, but she goes around and she gets a much better job working in television. At this point, she's just working in the publicity department for his publishing house. basically.
Yeah.
And stands up to her, and her, like, I guess, adversarial coworker, Perpetua, I think her name is, actually
slightly senior and therefore thinks she's my boss. Yeah.
Exactly. Actually backs her up. She's like, no, I want to make sure that she actually sticks with what she's about to do. And that's where, you know, she says, I'd rather be wiping Saddam Hussein's ass, which is kind of a dated reference now, but, you know, 2001, it works. So I love that moment is another, like, cheer-worthy moment, I think. Yeah.
Well, that's another thing that I really like too, is I know I don't know if there's anything I don't like about this movie, honestly, other than mom's racism, but that's, you know.
Yeah. Oh, the Japanese. Oh, cruel race.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I know. I caught that.
Such a cruel people. His cruel wife. Like, oh, man. But yeah, that's another thing about Bridget that I really admire is she's had this trouble with Daniel. She knows she needs to get away from him. She can't see him every day. Partly because he now supposedly is engaged to Lara from the New York office, but also just because she knows in herself, if she sticks around him, if he comes back ever, she's going to fall into that pattern again. She knows herself well enough to know that. So she goes out and gets another job. And then she comes back and she's like quitting because she's starting her new job on Monday. She didn't leave and get herself out of that situation because there was someone else for her. She was willing, someone who she wants to be in love, she wants to have a relationship, but she's totally willing, like we already mentioned, to be alone. She just wants to do something for herself. She wants to improve her own circumstances. And I think that's such a great thing about her. And you know, another of the many things that I love, and I find her so relatable because she's all about constantly, and that's what we see throughout this movie, she's constantly about her own personal evolution. Yeah, exactly. And that's part of what I think makes Renee Zellweger's performance so compelling, is that she is such a layered character, and she gets to be vulnerable, she gets to be strong, she gets to be kind of bumbling. I mean, when all is said and done, this is a comedy, so she gets the whole thing with the fire report going, which makes her basically, as she says, a laughing stock, and really the entire nation.
Exactly. And really plays into I think leads directly to Darcy's whole speech to her. There's a certain element of destiny too with the two of them, where they literally keep running into each other everywhere. Where she's supposed to cover this, she finally gets her first big story, and he shows up and coincidentally is able to help her out. He's the attorney that's representing the people she's supposed to interview and things like that. So there's a certain element of kind of, to reference another early 2000s rom-com, there's a little bit of serendipity at play as well with the two of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which, you always need those little coincidences in a good romantic comedy because life is full of them too. I mean, I've had situations where there's someone I'm interested in and I'll just like keep running into them places and I'm like, why are you here again? Like, how do I keep running into you? It happens in life.
Yeah, but a lot of times you don't see it for what it is, like you said. Like, exactly. I think that's the case here until that happens. So then we get the whole thing where she's cooking for her friends and he shows up, and that's the whole funny scene with the blue soup and all of that, and it's very
marmalade and
marmalade and gosh, it's kind of an accepting Darcy into the group sort of moment. How did you feel about the portrayal of her friends, which one of which who's I recognized right away as Moaning Myrtle, Shirley Henderson from the Harry Potter movies,
yep.
who it's even referenced at one point, and obviously this was not intentional, where she's calling Bridget, she's upset about a relationship thing, and she's trapped in the ladies' toilet, and I'm thinking, oh my God, just like Moaning Myrtle is trapped in the bathroom. It's like this actress can't get out of the bathroom. So what did
Which is so funny because she didn't even play that part until a year later. So yeah. I really love her friends because they each have such distinct personalities and we don't get a lot of time with them, but they're not just like this mass of three people that all kind of have the same personality. They each are very distinct. She has very different relationships with each of them. And, you get to know them a little bit too. And so that's why that scene where she goes and tells them what Mark has said about liking her, their reactions, like you as a viewer, you can kind of be a little bit surprised by it too, because you know before how they reacted to other things she said. And yeah, I think they're really, for the limited screen time supporting characters that they are, I think they're really well fleshed out.
I think the film finds a good balance of making it clear that she has a support system, but also not letting that support system like compromise the fact that this is Bridget's singular story. In a lot of rom-coms, you end up having, Meg Ryan and then like her best friend who's basically plays off of her in every single scene, relaying what has just happened in the relationship with, Tom Hanks or whoever it happens to be. I guess I'm talking about You've Got Mail because I've seen that a million times too.
Well, and a lot of times in these movies where you do have strong supporting actors, they end up sometimes overshadowing the leads. Like that happens big time I think in Notting Hill. Like Hugh Grant's friend in that, his roommate, I think he's way more memorable than Hugh Grant is, and Rosie O'Donnell in Sleepless in Seattle. And sometimes that can happen, and it definitely does not happen here. I think you're right. It's a very good balance.
And then, the film does a really good job of establishing not only her support group, but also the subplot with her parents, and kind of a mini portrait of a love at a much different stage, and how the difficulties that it takes to keep a couple together that far into the relationship. They actually get estranged, and the mom is dating this television personality, and the dad is in kind of a downward spiral, trying to figure out what to do. And like I think Bridget at one point gives him advice like, show up at this party and start flirting with people, which Jim Broadbent is not built to do apparently. So what are your thoughts on the subplot with her parents, and do you think it underscores something specific in Bridget's journey, or is it just to kind of add more layers to her life, I guess?
I think it adds more layers to her life. I think it accomplishes really developing the different relationships she has with each of her parents, because she's really close with her dad and not as much with her mom, which is pointed out by her mom. Like, you two have your own little club of two, and I'm not in the middle of that. But like, then her mom also is clearly this very lonely woman who starts to confide in her daughter because she doesn't have anyone else, and starts telling her details she does not want to hear. But I also I think it adds another interesting layer of storytelling too, because this really, and I know that this is something that men can enjoy this movie too. Clearly, I'm talking to you about it. But I think that this is something that just makes it even more a story for, by, and about women, because you see a lot of movies where men have midlife crises. It's very rare to see that where a woman is the one that's having that crisis of like, I don't know who I am anymore. I don't feel fulfilled by my relationship. And to see that play out is really interesting. It adds some funny moments as they're making all these comments about the color of Julian's skin. Mm-hmm. Up close, he's almost purple, But it's interesting to see that kind of dynamic, because like I said, it's not something that you normally see explored, and it really does delve into the fact that you have to, even when you have the one, you still have to care for that relationship. And that's something that happened between the two parents, is like, dad just kind of quit trying and didn't even realize that he had settled into a pattern that mom wasn't super excited about. Like, she wanted more from their relationship, and he just didn't even notice. And that's something that people have to be mindful of. Relationships take work forever, not just finding the relationship, but keeping it too.
Yeah. And I think the film does a good job of creating this kind of more realistic world where there isn't a happily ever after. Like you said, I mean, there's a line at one point in the film, I think Bridget herself says, whenever one part of your life starts going okay, another starts falling spectacularly to pieces, which is something that I've really found to be true. You know, I'm in my mid-30s too, similar to Bridget, it sort of is almost. And, you know, you really get work, you get your relationships set up, and then, work falls apart. And you have to like figure out, okay, what am I going to do now? Where do I go? You'll find yourself constantly, perpetually at a different crossroads in a different part of your life, romantically, socially, professionally, whatever. And it's, you know, as you mentioned, this is the rare film that really shows a woman trying to have her, which is appropriately enough, considering Renee Zellweger, have her little Jerry Maguire moment where she's, you know, that film is about a man who turns 35 and is like, okay, what am I going to, I don't have to tell you. I know you know all about Jerry Maguire and Tom Cruise. I'm just saying for people listening and don't remember Jerry Maguire that much. But yeah, he's at 35 and trying to figure out where he's going to do, like, who is he? How does he see himself? And is that reflected in the way others see him? And I think Bridget is definitely facing something very similar, and we get a well-rounded portrait of all the pressure she has from the different aspects of her life, what she sees with her parents, what she hears from her friends. There's a scene where she ends up going to a party, and there's, like, as she says, lots of smug married couples, and this one guy is like really
smug married couples.
This one guy, Wani, is like really relentless on her. I'm like, Jesus, what's up with Wani? I'm like, back off of her. Oh my God. You know, she's facing kind of on all sides pressure to figure out who she is internally and externally. And I think the film does a good job at, you know, exploring that and making it all feel more tangible than just, you know, your typical Hollywood rom-com would.
Yeah, exactly. And that's one of the things, too, where I love that it's inspired by Pride and Prejudice, but it is definitely not the same story. It's not this old-fashioned Regency era story. It's something very modern. It's something that even, you know, almost 20 years later, which, man, I can't believe it's been that long, but even, you know, 20 years later, it still feels very, very realistic. It still feels very tangible because this is a modern woman in modern times, and the experiences that she has, the people that she interacts with, those are all people that we know. We all have experiences similar, or at least run into certain things that are very much the same. And I think that a big part of that is because of the layers of the storytelling. I think it's just so well constructed. And I think so much of the credit for that, obviously the screenplay, but so much of the credit for that really does go to Sharon Maguire, because she's able to let this story play out in such a way that feels really natural.
Yeah, no one looking for love lives on an island, so it's really exploring the backdrop in which she has to kind of find herself. Mm-hmm. So to get back to the plot part of it, so then she's at the party with Mark Darcy, and they're hitting it off, and everything's starting to go well. And of course, Daniel shows up. He's like, I'm going crazy without you. You're the only one who can. Who I think he even says you're the only one who can save me, which is like, oh, dude, not the right play here.
No, definitely not. But the reason is, and this is what I was talking about before about him, she's the only one that's willing to call him on his bullshit. Right. He never gets that from anybody. And he knows deep down that he needs it, even if he doesn't know that that's what he needs. And he knows that she's the only one that can. So, yeah, it's a very interesting dynamic, because he's someone who needs to change and kind of knows that he needs to change, but also doesn't want to. So it's like, how do you reconcile that?
And I love the hesitance with which Darcy confronts him, where he sees Daniel and Bridget talking, and he's like, I'm going to leave. And then he goes down the stairs and then comes back. He's like, you know what? Let's step outside. And which transitions into this really hilarious fight where it's two very like prim and proper British men having a fist fight, which does get pretty like intense at certain points, but it's also like at other times they're like, oh, sorry, like apologizing because they're going in and out of windows. And what is your thoughts on that fight and the fact that her friends are like, oh, whose side are we on? It's like Mark, and then she said, well, Mark did steal Daniel's fiance years ago. Oh, that's true. And they're like trying to figure out who to place bets on. What are your take on that?
Well, and it's to the tune of It's Raining Men, which I just think is such a great song choice for that moment, because here you've got Bridget with two men literally fighting over her, and she doesn't quite know what to make of either of them, because both of them in her mind have serious issues. And but it's such a funny scene. I remember watching an interview where I think they were all on Oprah, and Hugh Grant, they asked, like, were there stunt doubles for the scene? And he said, no self-respecting stunt double would have fought like that. And it's just such a funny moment, but really also it is an eye-opener for Bridget as she's watching this unfold and realizing, even though, I'm sure that's very flattering to have two men in a fist fight over you, that's also not really what she wants either.
So then when it's all said and done, Darcy essentially wins the fight. So go Darcy. And that's when she actually sides with Daniel, and he says that if I can't make it with you, we can work with you. I can't make it work with anyone. And then she has the best response, which is essentially, again, this is I think the third consecutive time in this type of situation with Daniel, I believe too, where she's just like, yeah, no, that's not a good enough offer for me. And I that was so perfect, because so many times in these movies, they just go with the easy solution. Like, oh, he proved his love for me. He fought this guy. He really does care. He's going to change. It's like people don't change that easily. So
many other movies that would have a similar dynamic, she would go off with him and then later realize that she shouldn't be with him. But Bridget has already had enough history with Daniel, and she already knew who he was before she ever got together with him in the very first place, because she says in her opening that she shouldn't get involved with him. And so she already knows. And so when he says that, she's just like, no, this... Basically, what I love is she's got two men fighting over her, and she chooses herself.
Again, perfectly suited to the journey that she's on in this film. And then we have the scene where her parents reconnect, and it's interesting because he pretends that he has to think it over, and then he's like, I'm kidding with you. He's like, I just don't work without you. I feel like that line sort of implies a kind of codependency that almost doesn't sound so dissimilar from Daniel's perspective. Do you think that am I looking too deeply here, or do you think that they're even saying that even her parents' relationship isn't perfect, and that they have their own issues that they have to work out?
I'd never considered it in the context of what Daniel is saying, just because her dad is such a sweetheart. I think to me, I look at it more as just, they've been together for almost 30 years. Right. He doesn't know life without her. He probably was barely an adult when they got together. And so I think that's what it is. Like, he literally does not know how to live without her, because when she was gone, he's just sitting there crying all the time and lonely and can't function. And it's just so sad. But at the same time, it's not just that he needs her, he really does truly love her.
Right.
And I think it's such a beautiful, it's funny, and I love that he doesn't just immediately let her off the hook. He makes her stew just a little bit, but yeah, they're so cute.
It's a good counterpoint because the thing with Daniel happens, I think, almost the previous scene, and it's the distinction between I need you to fix me because I'm a mess without you, versus I need, I don't know, I can't picture my life without you, which is basically what Jim Broadbent's character is saying. So there's obviously a distinction there, but I do think that it's a contrast that feels purposeful on Sharon Maguire's part.
Yeah, and for Bridget to be overhearing that conversation and to see this is what everlasting love really looks like. And I love that kind of realization for her.
And then just when we think it's starting to wind down, Darcy announces that he not only is he engaged apparently to Natasha, who Embeth Davids, who is randomly in this movie.
Well, I think we need to kind of clear something up here too first, because there's been Bridget got wrong information about Mr. Darcy way back in the beginning.
Oh yeah, I skipped that. No, exactly. Yeah. That's the same. That's basically the scene right before this, I think.
Well, Well, so in the beginning, her mom starts to tell her something about him and his marriage, but kind of gets distracted, cut off. And so then her dad fills in the gaps of what he thinks is the truth, because he's a guy. He doesn't listen to gossip. He only hears half of it. And so he tells her the wrong thing, which is that Mark had cheated with his best friend's girlfriend or whatever. There had been some kind of cheating. And then later Daniel fills in the gaps and says, oh yeah, it was my fiance. And so she has believed, this is part of why she's been so resistant to Mark all the time, is because she has believed that he was this terrible person that broke up a relationship while he was married. And so when she finds out from her mom, no, that's not what happened. I know the actual gossip. He got cheated on by Daniel. That totally changes everything for her. She realizes, no, wait, Mark actually is a great guy. He's had this tragic thing happen to him. So that's why she wants to run off to the party and see him. And then finds out that he's engaged.
It also puts in much better context his reluctance to open himself up to romance with Bridget or kind of otherwise, because he seems it's a defining characteristic of him that he's very skittish around Bridget, probably because he is attracted to her from the first time that they encounter each other in the beginning of the movie. So then he's moving to New York, and Bridget, as is her way, has another instance of kind of word vomit, where she screams out, "No, losing one of our top person." Our top, right? Something like that.
Yeah. Losing one of our top people.
I'm sad. She's like, I'm sad for England, as a country that we're losing to the States and all that. So it ends up happening that she's, sitting down again in another one of her depressive modes, feeling like, oh, this guy sucks, and this other guy is a foregone conclusion that he's moving and he's in a relationship, but that's not going to happen. So they're planning on going to Paris, and
her friends show up.
Yeah, go ahead.
Like,
this movie better than I do.
Sorry, I have seen it seriously so many times, but so that's the thing. She's all depressed and lonely. She's sad about Mark leaving. And her friends show up and say, "Hey, let's get out of town. Let's just go away for the weekend. We're going to take you to Paris." And so she's like, "Yeah, sure, okay." So she packs a bag really quick, walks outside, and that's when Mark shows up. Mm-hmm. So you think, because you've had all these moments, this movie's got to be just about over. The story's almost over, but every time something happens, and that she's in love with Mark, but then he's getting married and moving away, but. Whatever. And then he shows back up and I love it.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
They really build up to that kiss. They're leaning in, and then they say something else, and they're leaning in, and then they're distracted because somebody's calling out, are you coming? No, that kind of thing. Yeah. And then of course they go upstairs and he finds the titular diary. And basically all her diary seems like it's half of it is, oh, Daniel, and half of it is like, oh, I hate Mark Darcy, underline. And I love that, not only is this does it do this sort of classic rom-com thing where people are chasing after each other down the streets and that kind of stuff, but that we get the misdirect where we think that he's like, oh, changed his mind again. And then we get you could do the reveal. So we get the scene where she's chasing him and he's like, oh, she's like, oh, she's chasing him and she's like, oh, diaries are just full of crap. He's like, and then we get the reveal that what he's doing.
So he saw her diary, and so then he takes off while she's out of the room. So she realizes that he has seen the diary, so she chases after him to be like, no, it's not what you think. And she says, everybody knows that diaries are full of crap. And then he says, I know. And he pulls out a brand new diary and he says, I just thought you'd like to start with something new. And it's like, Mark Darcy really is the perfect man. Because he understands.
I literally wrote in my notes, "Aw," in all caps with exclamation points, because that's such a sweet moment. And it really, it's the period at the end of the sentence of explaining who this guy is and why she should be with him. After everything, the just as you are and all of this, and then he sees something that he could be obviously, offended by and kind of defensive of, and instead realizes, that they didn't really know each other. She was basing her opinions of him on false information, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, you know what? Let's just start from scratch. A new chapter of your life, literally new diary. I love that. That's so great.
It is. And that's one of the things that makes Mark Darcy a really interesting person, too, because he has every reason to be upset. And it's not just that he's like, whatever, it's fine. He is able to contextualize where she was coming from when she wrote those things. And I don't think it's overtly stated, but I don't think it needs to be. He recognizes his own behavior over the past year or so that they have been acquainted. And he's able to say, like, hey, you know what? This is a clean start for both of us. And that's what you get in that moment. And it's so sweet. It's so sweet. And it's interesting because I think that the way it's filmed, the way it plays out, it manages to not feel cheesy. Mm-hmm. Which it very easily could have.
Oh, for sure. I mean, that's usually how a movie like this would end. And I think he does say at one point, I think before he's saying how he likes her, he does say something about owns up to his rude behavior and all of that early on, because, he keeps dropping reference earlier in their encounters that she was like a little girl running around in his like pool, like in the neighborhood or whatever, running naked in the pool. And that was like, I guess, how they knew each other as children. So they kind of were like in the same circle back then. I think their parents are friends or something, which is why they keep going to the Darcy's party all the time.
Their parents were in the same circles. There's a little bit of an age difference. So she was much younger. So she didn't remember him really. Right. He probably, knowing the kind of family that he grew up in, he probably went to boarding school. So she wouldn't have known him in high school or anything like that. And then he went off to college and stuff. So they probably hadn't seen each other since they were children. But yeah, he owns it. He says at one point, I love he even makes the point of like, yeah, I said all these terrible things. Plus I was wearing a really nasty, ugly sweater that my mother picked out for me. So it's like, there's this little self-deprecation there too. Like he recognizes that he looked ridiculous as well. Because that's the thing, is she's always very aware of how ridiculous she looks. It's kind of nice for her to hear that he recognized that about himself too.
And there's a symmetry there because her mom made her put on that carpet dress right before she got there. So, and you kind of overhear him talking to his mom where she's trying to set him up with somebody too. So there's a little bit of matchmaking going on both sides, I think, of this relationship.
Yeah, so, exactly.
Definitely, I think Karen and I would both recommend that you all check out this movie if you haven't seen it, because I love the end of this movie so much. I think that's probably part of the reason that I didn't bother seeing the sequel. I was just like, it looks like the same. Okay, she's going to have to choose between the two of them again, because that's I think probably the way it was marketed. And certainly the poster is just, she's back between these two guys. What's going to happen? And I'm like, well, we resolved this. Now we're just treading water. But if you say it's underrated, maybe I should give it a chance.
Yeah, because the story develops a little bit differently, because it starts off she and Mark are fully in a relationship, and then being Bridget, she kind of screws it up a little bit, and they're not together when she runs back into Daniel.
Right.
So she does end up in a situation where she kind of has to make a choice, but it feels like I could totally see this, like this happens to people. So obviously it's a little bit exaggerated what happens to her. It's definitely worth seeing where their story goes, because it's not just this really romantic kiss while she's, half naked in the snow at the end of Bridget Jones's Diary. There's more to their story, because like we see with her parents, there's no such thing as happily ever after. You still have to do some more work and put in the effort.
Exactly. I think that's essentially the mission statement of this movie. You have to do work on, your love life and also yourself, and that's kind of where Bridget starts in the beginning of the movie. So I think that's a nice way to wrap up our conversation. So, Karen Peterson, thank you so much for being on the Crooked Table podcast. Can you tell people where they can find you on social media?
Yeah, I am on Twitter and Instagram. That's the easiest way to find me. I'm at Karen M. Peterson, and you can find links to everywhere that I am and everything that I'm doing there.
Excellent. Well, thanks again for coming on. This was a lot of fun. And I think I haven't really talked about very many romantic comedies since relaunching the podcast in this kind of format. So I think it's great that we got the chance to talk about this film, which, like I said, I hadn't seen in forever. So.
Well, thank you for letting me defend one of my favorites. It was really fun. Thanks so much.
I was under the impression it was generally well regarded. I didn't even realize it needed to be defended. I thought it was too. Hopefully, this podcast will help cement the respect for Bridget Jones's Diary.
That's right.
If you're interested in joining me on the show to chat about one of your favorite films, head on over to crookedtable.com/guest. Or you can consider supporting the show at patreon.com/crookedtable. Of course, you can always find more podcasts, reviews, videos, and other movie-related goodies over at crookedtable.com. Until next time, this has been the Crooked Table Podcast, and I've been Rob.
This has been a production of crookedtable.com. All rights reserved.
CROOKED.